How is it that humanity went from roving bands picking up berries to being so obsessed with shopping that it may destroy the planet? Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. Today we are covering two more chapters in Murray Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom. This video is for chapters 3 and 4. That is The Emergence of Hierarchy, chapter 3, and The Epistemologies of Rule, chapter 4. And that means we're talking all about scarcity, early societies, or what Bookchin calls organic societies, the development of religions and the shaman, and the way that the logic of domination and hierarchy infected our minds, not just our societies, but our minds on a personal level. As always, please check out the Patreon channel. That's patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism, where all of this and much more is up. All of this main feed stuff is freely available over there, so you can go back and look at past books that we've done, things like The Wretched of the Earth, Manufacturing Consent. There may be some quacking behind me this episode, by the way, because my dog, say hi up, he has a new duck toy, so that's what that is. Anyway, you can check out all of that up on that Patreon feed. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and let me know what you think. I'm really enjoying all of the comments. This particular book, The Ecology of Freedom, has really connected with a lot of people. So it's just really cool to get all that feedback and have people engaging with this. So all of that's tremendous. I love you all very much. Thank you so much. Let's break down this video though. So for this video, we've got a lot of ground to cover, and there are things in chapters 3 and 4 that will come up again later on in the book. So we won't necessarily spend too much time on a couple things, and I will point them out when they come up. I've split this video into 7 sections, and that may seem like a lot, but you'll see why in just a sec. And these 7 sections are based on ideas that kind of run through both chapters. So we're going to talk about scarcity, we're going to talk about patriarchy, we're going to talk about the rise of the shaman, we're going to talk about the rise of the state, we're going to talk about this mental takeover, and then we're going to go through some of the major criticisms and end on takeaways, because I think that there's a lot that you can criticize about the anthropology, but I do want to end on an idea of what we can still take from chapters 3 and 4, even with all of those anthropological criticisms in place. Now, a lot of these criticisms I'm pulling from a very specific book that a lot of people mentioned in the comments, and so I went through and read, and it is perfect. It goes perfectly with The Ecology of Freedom, but that is, of course, David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything, a book that came out back in 2022, and I don't understand why, but it became a bestseller. And I say I don't understand why, not because it's not a great book. It is a great book, but it's really dense, and it's very difficult to get through. There's a lot of material just packed in there, so it doesn't immediately seem to me like it would be a bestseller just flying off the shelves, but hey, who am I to question it? Now, in The Dawn of Everything, the authors dismiss this section of The Ecology of Freedom, and actually the entirety of the anthropology in The Ecology of Freedom, in one single footnote. That's chapter 7, footnote 17, and they say, in adopting the title of Bookchin's landmark volume on social ecology, we cannot follow his own ideas about human prehistory or the origins of agriculture, which are based on information that is now many decades out of date. It is brutal. But they go on to say that there is much to learn from Bookchin's basic insight here, and that is what we're going to talk about today. And that, by the way, is also my view on this book, even though there's a lot of things that Bookchin just sort of assumes about the world and anthropology and human prehistory. There's a lot still to take away from this book. We're going to talk about all of it. But let's get into it, and let's start with the idea of scarcity. If you ask any economist, the way economies and societies are structured is all to deal with the problem of scarcity. Scarcity is we don't have enough of something. So we don't have enough food, so we must go hunt. We don't have enough fuel, so we must go chop down trees. We don't have enough shelter, so we must build a camp for the night. All of this that is involved in early societies is to deal with the problem of scarcity. And in Bookchin's account, those early organic societies, the sort of pre-literate humanity, is always dealing with the problem of scarcity. They never have enough. On a literal basis, so they're literally for survival. And Bookchin believes that because of this scarcity in early societies, those societies were very much in harmony with nature, genuinely because resources were scarce. So all hands needed to be on deck. Anyone and everyone in these societies was useful. And it's how Bookchin gets to the idea that men and women were both treated equally in these early Neolithic societies because they were both necessary. So hierarchy for Bookchin only emerges when you have dealt with the problem of scarcity, when you start accumulating resources beyond what you need for basic survival. What does that look like? Well, basically, we have an extra abundance of something. We have something extra, and now we need to figure out how to distribute it, what to do with it. Now, early societies, Bookchin says, may have had ways to deal with this. So Bookchin, for example, talks about potlatch in the early societies of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. Potlatch is a gift-giving tradition where people will demonstrate their wealth and their power by giving things away, giving gifts and resources, and in some occasions actually destroying these things to demonstrate just how much they have to give away. And it's, for Bookchin, an early way to deal with the problem of excess without it turning necessarily into hierarchy. Now, we can question those assumptions, but this is how Bookchin gets to that idea of maybe there was some mechanism in these early societies to deal with the problem of the accumulation or overaccumulation of certain resources. But he says, as hierarchy emerged and some people began to dominate other people, this became a real problem. And all of a sudden, those ways of dealing with excess started to end. The breakdown in this order comes with a really interesting idea that comes through in this book. In these early chapters, this is specifically chapter 3, where Bookchin talks about the fetishization of needs. Now, to talk about the fetishization of needs, we got to back up for a sec and talk about Karl Marx. Now, Marx has the idea of the fetishization of commodities, or commodity fetishism. If you've read any of Capital, this is where this idea comes from. And Marx himself is actually borrowing already kind of an argument from the early anthropologists of his era, where people talk about fetishes. This is not in any kind of sexual sense. This is a fetish where we endow something as something that's totemic with a specific significance beyond its actual use. And so Marx says that we endow things beyond their actual use value. So that is to say, we value things as if they were inherently worth something beyond what we should actually be using to value things, which for Marx is mostly labor. So we fetishize commodities on Marx's account. And Bookchin takes that very same idea, but he applies it in a different way. For Bookchin, we don't fetishize commodities. Well, we do in Bookchin's account, but more than that, we fetishize needs. So we elevate the status of needs beyond anything that's actually connected to our survival, which is to say, beyond anything connected to our actual needs. Bookchin says that in a capitalist system, production happens for the sake of production, and consumption happens for the sake of consumption. And if you've ever been on Amazon.com just kind of browsing for things to buy, which happens to a lot of us, and listen, I'm not innocent in this, you will know what that feels like. Bookchin basically is describing a situation in which we are trapped in a never-ending shopping mall of purchases that we just don't need. Now, very interestingly, he thinks that the way out of this is actually superabundance. And he has this idea that if you try to clamp down on this idea of people consuming beyond what they actually need in any other way besides superabundance, you may lead to an argument that justifies something like eco-fascism, where you just clamp down from the top down in a very authoritarian way on people's consumption of certain things. And Bookchin is not interested in that, and so his idea of how to get out of that is just inundate people with stuff, superabundance. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but this is an idea that we will return to later in the book, so I won't go through too much of this now. If you have strong thoughts just at the beginning of this book, we are still only in chapter 3, let me know in the comments. I'm always interested to hear this, but I don't know if there's a very good answer to deal with this absolute obsession with consuming things beyond our actual material needs. I think that's kind of one of the modern problems, or one of the problems that's at the heart of modern society. I don't know if there's a good answer to this beyond literal revolution, just completely changing our relationship with the world and with society, which is absolutely something that Bookchin is interested in, but superabundance, I don't know that that makes a ton of sense to me. Anyway, I will leave this idea here for now and move on to Bookchin's story. Basically, Bookchin is trying to tell a story of how these early organic societies gradually started to turn into hierarchies. And then, by the time of classical antiquity, which is the early ancient Greece, it had started to turn into class societies. So we get organic society, then we get the emergence of hierarchy, and then we get the emergence of class. Let's start with the patriarchy. Bookchin's story here is similar to one that we've heard many times before. So early humanity is comprised of roving bands of people that survived as hunter-gatherers, and then they started settling down, and as they settled down, they started to develop agriculture, and then you get this explosion of agriculture, and those agricultural settlements start to expand, and they start to take over the territory that's being used by the hunter-gatherers because they can just accumulate power in these agricultural centers, and then they start to go to war with other settlements. Now, that's not necessarily true, and we'll get to these criticisms later, but let's take Bookchin on his own terms here and explore this idea just for a sec. Let's assume that that is actually the case, and let's go into Bookchin's argument for how patriarchy developed, or the hierarchy that divides men and women. So remember, Bookchin believes in gender equality in those early organic societies because everyone is necessary. But Bookchin says, as soon as you start accumulating this stuff, as soon as you start setting down roots and going to war with others, all of a sudden that war component means that you don't actually need carers as much as you need warriors. You are no longer living at the knife's edge of subsistence. Now, all of a sudden, you want to go and take some stuff. And in that kind of society, it's men who come out at the front as the best warriors, the most naturally capable, most violent people that you need them to go out and fight your wars. And so women take kind of a backseat in these kind of early societies, and this is where you get that early division between men and women that leads to patriarchal societies later on. So that is to say, as warriors predominate, the role of men becomes much more important, women take a back seat, and you have a ready-made gender hierarchy. And Bookchin tells us these early hierarchies are all based on kind of immediate, biological, completely observable differences. They will mutate into hierarchies that we know and love now, right? Racial hierarchies, class hierarchies, structures way above these. But these first hierarchies are kind of the most fundamental, and they are things like patriarchy. And now let's talk about another very interesting idea, which is the rise of the shaman. Now, because we now have a gender hierarchy, because we now need to defend ourselves and go to war, we need to start thinking about not just men and women, but also old and young, another major division in these early organic societies, especially as they start to settle down and start to go to war with one another. And again, they don't actually really necessarily settle down and start to go to war with another. This is a very, very fluid thing if you actually look at the evidence that we have for human prehistory. But again, let's give Bookchin a little bit of space here to develop his argument before we go in and just like shred it to pieces. Bookchin looks at this early division between old and young and says, well, early on, early organic societies, before they start, going to war and settling down and agricultural explosion and all of this, early societies needed the value of the elders through their wisdom. They needed the wisdom that the elders in a society could provide. Again, you are on a knife's edge of precarity. You are trying to survive in a wilderness that is trying to eat you. And if you have an elder in there who can explain that this is edible and this is not, this is what you do when you are wounded, and this is what you do not do when you are wounded, that is incredibly important. But now that you're going to war, it's actually no longer as valuable. Now you need, again, warriors and violent people. You need people who are young, who can go out and wage war, and who can defend your settlement. And so the elderly, in Bookchin's account, take a real backseat in the society. Now, that's a hierarchy, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that in Bookchin's story, because the elderly will try to hang on to their power that they have in a society. They'll try to remain relevant as much as possible. And this is where you get the rise of the shaman. The shaman is a person in a society who lays claim to some kind of mythical power, something sort of beyond normal humans. They have access to something in nature or in mythology or some kind of mythic power that normal people just can't access. And so an older person looking to retain their power in early society will try to hang on to that power by assuming the role of shaman. It is no longer just a wisdom between picking this berry and that berry. It is a wisdom based on access to something that the young just can't access. It's an appeal to mysticism. Now, the early shaman is kind of a religious figure, but more of a political figure. This is a form of early politics because the shaman needs to play this power struggle, this kind of deeply political game to retain access to power and keep things under his control. He needs to balance the interests of people in this early society so that they can retain power. And from the shaman comes the rise of the state, at least as far as Bookchin is concerned. And that takes us into chapter 4. So let's talk about the rise of the state a little bit. And we should start by saying that chapter 4 is not actually really concerned with the rise of the state. Chapter 4 is much more about how we have internalized the logic of the state. We'll get to that in a little bit where we get to the real meat of this kind of mental takeover, as I've decided to describe it. This is my word, mental takeover. The word that Murray Bookchin chooses to use is the Epistemologies of rule. I just figured that was like really complicated and kind of annoying, but we'll talk about the epistemologies of rule in just a sec, and let's hang on to the actual material world of the state. Because Bookchin sees the state as kind of composed of two different effects. He says the state is about the material world. They literally control you, but they also control the way you look at the world, the way you gain knowledge, the way you understand the world. This is an epistemology, by the way. The theory of knowledge is epistemology. Again, we'll come to it. But let's talk about the material world first, because really, what is the state? The state, ultimately, is violence, or the ability to enact violence. And by the way, this is not just an anarchist perspective. This is a very common perspective, a very common view of the state throughout a lot of political science. The ability of a controlling apparatus within a society to crack down on offenders of laws, people who break the laws. You can punish them with violence. You can protect the borders of a given region with violence. You can go and wage wars and conquer other places with violence. You can impose the will of the state, which functions for the larger society, through violence. All of this happens necessarily through violence or the threat of violence. And so if you're a political scientist, you will talk about the legitimate use of violence, that sort of thing. But this is what underpins our modern understanding of the state. And the state, for Bookchin, happens around the advent of the city, because the city allows this concentration, and it's much easier to exert power over a concentrated population than it is to try to enact your will over roving and disparate bands of people that are kind of out there just trying to exist and survive. As soon as people come together through common agriculture and commonly have to deal with each other and interact with each other through rules, well, all of a sudden you need a state to govern all of that. And the functions of the state go hand in hand with the development of the market. And that should make a lot of sense to you as well. If you're just in a society where you kind of know everybody and you interact in more of a, what David Graeber would refer to as a gift economy, sort of my neighbor needs this, so I'll give him this, and then the next time that I need something, maybe he'll give me something that I need. Now all of a sudden you have sort of regulated commerce, and people who don't obey the rules of those commerce, well, you need a threat of violence to make sure that they do obey those rules governing commerce. So the development of the market and the development of what will eventually become what Marx will call the capitalist mode of production, all of that goes hand in hand with the city. Now, when the state starts to roll around, you see the balance of power shift, and it shifts away from the shaman. Bookchin thinks that in the early societies, the shaman holds all the power. He kind of holds all the cards here. But the state is, as we just said, the state is based on violence. And who has power in a violent world? The military. So the power of the military in any given city and those who control the military, the person who mandates the military, will be able to supplant the power of the shaman. But now let's talk about the other side of the state. The reason that we are here in this chapter, the mental takeover, the epistemologies of rule. Now, epistemology, as I've said, is the theory of knowledge. And Bookchin has this idea, he's trying to prove in this chapter that the hierarchies and domination and rule and the state, they all literally change our brains. They change the literal way that we perceive the world, the way we gain knowledge of the world, the way we know the world, the way we understand the world. This logic of the state pervades our minds themselves. And that is a really, really powerful idea. It's not a unique idea to Bookchin. A lot of people have made this point over the course of time, but this is a really, really interesting way to put it. And I think it's one that absolutely stands up. As much as we can criticize Bookchin's anthropology, we'll come back to this idea. But this is, I think, inarguable. This is pretty undeniable. Now, Bookchin looks at this on two different perspectives. One is where he talks about the ancient Hebrews, and one is where he talks about the ancient Greeks. But he takes a little bit of a detour earlier on to talk about bears, and I think we should talk about that very quickly. Now, he puts forward this idea that in early societies that are completely in tune with nature, it is normal to thank the bear. The individual bear, after a hunt that has killed this bear, you thank the bear for their sacrifice, right? For its sacrifice and for its meat that you are going to use to sustain yourselves. And through this, you get to another idea, which is beyond that individual bear that we're thanking, perhaps there is a bear spirit that connects all of the different bears. From that idea, you get the shaman. The shaman is there to be in touch with the bear spirit, to be in touch with the force that connects all the bears so that the shaman can speak to the bear and perhaps in the next hunt, deliver a bear for you to consume. So all of this is a type of mysticism that emerges from nature. And that's where the Hebrew God comes in. So for the ancient Hebrews, you get something completely new, which is the emergence of the Hebrew God. The Hebrew God is different. The Hebrew God, Bookchin says, is outside of and dominates nature. I am that I am, the Hebrew God tells Moses in Exodus 3:14. And this is something that is completely different because this is ultimately a justification of domination that appeals to a power that is absolutely beyond nature and the natural world. And it's pretty likely that this will change your perspective of the world. If you believe that there is some God, like the Hebrew God, that exists outside of nature, that commands, and people can appeal to the authority of this God that exists outside of nature, that will absolutely influence the way that you view nature. Nature all of a sudden is not something to be coexisted with, it is something to be dominated. And this, I think, is one of those things that really survives. Even the takedown of the anthropological arguments that are in Murray Bookchin's book here, is his chapters 3 and 4. This idea, I still think, is very much with us. It still kind of pervades our mind, especially if you grew up kind of vaguely around religion. I actually think that this idea that there is a force of domination that is outside of nature is a lot more pervasive than we like to admit. But listen, that's the ancient Hebrews. Let's go on to the ancient Greeks now, because the ancient Greeks, kind of on the other hand, they didn't justify anything by appealing to something beyond nature. They justified their domination and their hierarchies by appealing to reason. And Bookchin says that reason and thought are absolutely key for these ancient Greeks, and he draws on the great philosophers Plato and Aristotle to make this point. And he says that Aristotle and Plato were extremely authoritarian, which they absolutely were. You get this separation of Greeks and, well, barbarians and women and slaves because the Greeks were the ones who were most capable of logical reasoning. This is Bookchin's argument here, and classicists may rightly quibble with this idea. However, you do absolutely get this separation between ancient Greeks and those that they dominated. And the argument here is that because Greeks have such fine faculties of reason and they are so intelligent, it just makes sense. It is better. It is a better circumstance that they dominate non-Greeks. Hierarchy maintains the balance, and nature by the very same logic, must also be dominated, because reason can't exist in the wild. It just can't exist out in the wilderness. You must dominate nature so that man can harness reason, can reason properly. And this view, I think, of reason and using reason and higher reasoning faculties to justify domination of others, I think is actually very, very much still with us. I think this is something that pervades a lot of our thinking without us ever realizing this. We've talked before about something called the civilizing mission. We've spoken about this quite a lot before, actually, especially with any book that dealt with colonization. Because a lot of those early colonizers, when they're going out, Eduardo Galeano talks about this in Open Veins of Latin America, but they go out, and it's not just for exploitation, or at least, of course, it's very much about getting gold and silver out of the ground, but it's also about civilizing the savages. It's about expanding Christ's kingdom across the world. It's about going under the banner of your God and civilizing people. It's this civilizing mission. And that civilizing mission is still very much with us. Anytime you hear a politician talk about how we need to help these poor people in X far-flung country because they are so backwards, that is still the logic of the civilizing mission. And Bookchin, I think, has done a very, very good job of tracing this kind of back to, I don't know if it's literally its origins, but at least in a starting point in classical antiquity. But let's step back here for a sec. And let's talk about some criticisms. Now, we heard some of Bookchin's critics last time when we talked about deep ecology versus social ecology, but I think that this is actually the slightly more damning criticism of a work like the Ecology of Freedom, which is still a tremendous work that has endured the test of time for a very good reason. But when you look at the anthropological evidence, and Dawn of Everything does a really good job of sort of assembling this and pulling it all together, and if you want another criticism of stuff like this, you can look at David Graeber's other books, especially Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which we will be doing on this channel. But when you assemble the anthropological evidence, you realize that a lot of what Murray Bookchin's story is telling is just based on pure assumption, and it is not grounded in anthropology in any meaningful sense. And when you read a book like The Dawn of Everything, you realize just how little we actually know about human prehistory. So Bookchin's anthropology here, it's doing a lot of what the people who came before Bookchin did as well, which is just coming up with an explanation that seems to make sense. It kind of makes sense, and you build this explanation from something a story that you could tell, and you run with it. And, it's sort of going backwards. So we now know, for example, that there are plenty of early societies that waffled on this line between, early agriculture. They would dabble in agriculture, and then they would go back to hunter-gatherer. A lot of the hunter-gatherer societies were much more well off and dominated the agricultural societies because turns out early agricultural society could fail very easily. And so the expansion of agriculture took place over thousands of years. This is not just some quick, abrupt shift that allows the agricultural settlements to start dominating the rest of the world. Really, it happened kind of the other way around until some of this kind of playful agriculture that they were doing around the margins started to make actual headway. And so you get a transition to a more agricultural-based economy. But it's not a simple trend through human history. That is not a story that has any basis in real-world life or archaeology or anthropology. Then, of course, there were hunter-gatherers that waged war, and there were agriculturalists that lived in relative peace, and vice versa. There were cities that developed with states, and cities where there is very little evidence that there was much centralized state apparatus whatsoever. There is, in other words, a complexity to this story that Bookchin just can't access. And this book is very much a product of its time. A lot of this stuff is just recent anthropological work that we can now draw on. And so Graeber and Wengrow rightly say that this is outdated, but it's also a little bit a problem with Bookchin's method, which is, as I say, reasoning backwards. He goes from his explanation to the facts instead of kind of the other way around. There's this passage in The Dawn of Everything that I think sums all of this up just really, really beautifully. It's right in the first chapter. They say, when we simply guess as to what humans in other times and places might be up to, we almost invariably make guesses that are far less interesting, far less quirky, in a word, far less human. than what was likely going on. I may eventually add Dawn of Everything to this reading list. One person in the comments rightly pointed out that Dawn of Everything has also been very criticized. That's going to happen with any book that achieves this kind of stature and this kind of like bestseller status. From where I'm sitting, and I am not a trained anthropologist, I cannot emphasize this enough, but from where I'm sitting, it may be the case that they've misinterpreted things or they're arguing too forcefully for one perspective. That happens a lot with Graeber, especially. But I think that the larger picture that Graeber and Wengrow are trying to put forward in this book, which is there is a complexity to early human development that no single story and no single narrative will understand, I think that is absolutely undeniable. And what that means is that a lot of books that claim to have just draw a line from point A to point B and say this was human history, and that's, everything from Murray Bookchin to Jared Diamond, that doesn't really have the explanatory power that we think it has. But let's move away from the criticisms here. Let's go to some takeaways, because that's maybe a little bit more interesting. Because I have just argued against basically the entire premise of both of these chapters. So what survives? What can we still take away from this material, even if the anthropological argument isn't necessarily there? I think a lot. First of all, you have the criticisms of modern capitalist society from chapter 3, which I think are very, very powerful. Things about the production for the sake of production, the consumption for the sake of consumption, this idea of the fetishization of needs. I think all of this is inarguable. I absolutely love it. I think it's something that any modern leftist existing in the world right now has to wrestle with. Also from that chapter, you have the problem of scarcity, and you have the problem of dealing with scarcity, which will come back as we look at Bookchin's ideas for how to design a society that won't fall into the trap of hierarchy, because scarcity is a problem that will always exist. And Bookchin's treatment of it here, in chapter 3 especially, is absolutely fascinating. So I think that absolutely pulls through. Then, those criticisms that we just went through with the ancient Greeks and the Hebrews and the philosophical breakdown of their justifications for hierarchy is brilliant, and it is important. Does it potentially oversimplify the thought of the ancient Greeks and Hebrews? Yup. However, does the criticism survive? Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it does. And finally, we haven't mentioned this yet, but at the end of chapter 4, Bookchin talks about human nature, and he says that human nature does exist, but it seems to consist of proclivities that are defined by the installation of social needs. We talked about this before when we talked about Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman is really interested in this idea of what is human nature, what is natural, because a lot of the criticism that Goldman was getting back at the time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of the pushback that she's getting at this point is anarchism is just not in tune with how humans are. Bookchin is also really interested in this idea. Is there a human nature? Bookchin says yes, but that human nature is just things we kind of want to do, and all of those are conditioned by the society that we live in. And if you can change the society that we live in, you can change what we observe to be human nature. You at least can change the way that humans behave. So it's an open question, right? How much of this violence and domination in modern society is a product of human nature, and how much of it is learned? We can't really know the answer to that, but Bookchin would say mostly it's socialized. And that's important, and I completely agree, and we will leave it there. We'll lay chapters 3 and 4 to rest. If you have thoughts about anything that we've covered here, and I know we've covered a lot of stuff, so, let me know what you think about any of this and all of this. I love reading those comments. Please let me know. Next week, we will talk about chapters 5 and 6, which means we'll hit the halfway point of the Ecology of Freedom, which is really, really exciting. And if you've made it that far, congratulations. I will see you next week. Don't forget to check out that Patreon feed if you get a chance. All that cool stuff is up there. I will see you next time. Thank you very much.